see my the microphone is voice right there.
But it cannot work while charging.
Is it still charging?
No.
We can't get enough to plug in?
I did, but
But oh, okay. Okay, so now we're going to, our firms are going to be our Calvo sticky price firms that we had the last several days. Except now we're going to see with this open economy, these different price levels, like producer price, consumer price, are going to start to play a role. So we look at our firm's log marginal costs, and we can, and here in the model, Gali assumes he adds in a employment subsidy optimization problem that we can have in the baseline model as well. But our marginal costs are going to be the same, except if you look at it now, we have the difference between the nominal wage and the producer price index, which would be the real wage from the firm's perspective. So it's the wage relative to the producer price index, but it's not the real wage from the consumer perspective. Right? For our consumers, we want to know how many goods we can buy with our dog, not just how many Vietnamese goods we can buy in an hour of work, but all the goods that we're interested in buying. All right, so we have our to solve the first order problem for the firm, we get just like we had before, that the price for firms who are able to adjust their prices is going to be, is the log price, is going to be the markup times the logs and plus the discounted sum of current and future and future nominal marginal costs, but here we have our real marginal costs and our domestic producer price level. So let's try and bring things together. So a small open economy IS curve. What are we going to have here? We have this forward-looking output gap relation, just like in the closed economy, right? That came from the forward-looking output relationship, that came from the forward-looking consumption behavior of our households from optimization, output consumption savings problem. Right? We're going to have the additional channel of the real exchange rate, right? Real exchange rate depreciation. So if our currency depreciates, it loses value, our goods are then less expensive to people abroad. Right? This is going to boost our net exports, which is a component of demand. Right? And how open our economy is how exposed we are to these open economy effects. So these this import, this export boost from real exchange rate depreciation is going to be scaled by this degree of openness. All right, so what do we see here? Well, like before, demand depends on the real interest rate. and a closed economy, but now it also depends on the real exchange rate. So let's put this together then. So for every good I, for every good J, where our total, our production of good J in our economy is equal to the demand of this good J by domestic consumers and the demand of country I of this good J from our country, right? And this is for all countries J in our continuum of countries. Right, so our aggregate demand and output functions. We have the demand for good J domestically is going to be based on the relative price of this good relative to the other domestic goods. And it's going to be related to the relative price of our domestic goods to our total consumer price index, right? Where we also have the price of our imports in here. The effect so this gives us how easily we substitute across different goods. And this is the elasticity with which we substitute between domestic and foreign goods. And we have our openness, or our home bias here out in front. And we have similar relations for every country I and their demand of a good K from us. Right? They look at the relative price of that good to the rest of the price, the rest of the goods from our basket. They relate the price of the basket to their basket of the exchange rate, and we have their basket's composure and their exchange rate level. Look at this. That's right. So we have gamma is elasticity between countries in the foreign basket. If we don't have that, in our demand, because we compare the home goods with the whole basket of all foreign goods to get to our foreign baskets. For a foreign country, our goods are just the goods of one of the many countries' goods in its basket of foreign goods. So we see how it's able to substitute amongst different foreign goods, different foreign countries' goods in assembling the foreign country basket. And then it puts this into this elasticity of foreign goods relative to its CPI, which depends also on its own production. And we have the exchange rate there, because we want this is going to be the price level in its country and its currency. Right, so we're dividing the price of our goods, which are producer price in our currency, by the exchange rate, so that we can express the price of our goods in the foreign country's currency. And it's then comparing this with all the other countries in its foreign goods basket. Okay, so this gives us foreign demand for good K. This is domestic demand for good J. What's the takeaway here? Well, of course, demand for any good J of ours is going to depend on our total demand for goods. Also, any demand for a good K is going to depend on the foreign income. And it's going to depend negatively, positively. It's going to depend positively on the exchange rate, right? Which means our exports depend positively on the exchange rate, right? With the exchange rate the way it's defined here. If the exchange rate goes up, this means the dong depreciates, right? So our goods become less expensive for foreigners in their own currency, which is why we get the positive dependence on the exchange rate. Right, we can put this all together, so it's the total demand, foreign and domestic, for good J in our economy. Right, we have some things that are shared. Right, that's the price of good J relative to the rest of the goods that we produce. Right, and we have then the domestic part of demand, and then we have all the foreign demand, not just from country I, but from all the different countries I and the rest of the world. Now if we aggregate over all goods J, right, we're going to get then this component in here. It's going to be the total demand for goods at home, scaled by the relative price of our goods with our consumer price index. Why? This is our domestic production. So this is the total production of Vietnamese goods. The total production of Vietnamese goods is equal to the demand for Vietnamese goods by the Vietnamese. But our demand for goods isn't just for Vietnamese goods, we also demand foreign goods. Right? Which is why, right, whether we consume more or less Vietnamese goods than we do goods from the whole world on average, it's going to depend on the relative price, and then this degree of openness or home bias. Right? And then we have the demand from abroad, from all the countries in the world. And what we want to get here is we want to see if we can get out of looking at all the countries I individually, right, and all of the bilateral exchange rates, and see if we can get this expressed in terms of some world or total foreign demand. Right, and this is where the risk sharing condition makes our life very useful. Actually, I need to change that. That's always find new typos. It's this risk sharing condition that allows us to relate the consumption in any country to our consumption up to this real exchange rate effect and our sensitivity through ADA. No, that was right. Here, all that's been done to get to this real exchange rate is to express prices. If we pull this in, I should write this out. I'm going to keep that one more. I think that's useful. Parentheses, H, T, valuable exchange rate, I, T, is there minus gamma, is the relative price across countries and the foreign countries' demand of goods from the rest of the world. So ours relative to the rest of the countries for their demand, and this is the foreign relative to the CPI, so relative to their domestic plus foreign. Okay. Now, if we use our real exchange rate. So U I P is going to be I, it's going to be there. And we're going to bilaterally, so we want this to be the other, the inverse. Times then point so I can bring some of these terms together. Alright, so we have minus, 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 minus. Alright, so they're all
I think if the slide is correct, then Q equal to epsilon in the denominator.
Is that way around? Yeah, no, I think you're right. Yeah. This is the, This is real exchange rate from our perspective to the rest of the world, and that the now okay, that's the whole thing is going to be opposite. Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you. Trying to find it around backwards. No, it's not working out right. Yeah, so we get them epsilon I t. Then we can get epsilon I t, ft, and get eta minus gamma minus beta. Right here it's just q I t eta ct I. Right, and then we use the risk sharing result to relate the consumption century I to our consumption up to this real interest rate. I'm sorry, the real exchange rate effect. Right, so now when if we think about approximating this, right, what are we going to get? Right, we're going to get so this STI, SIT, it's QIT, and we're going to be averaging this across countries. Right, so we're going to get then here this alpha and the gamma would be our ST. Then we have the alpha eta minus 1 over sigma with our Q. Right? So we have both the terms of trade and the real exchange rate in there. The two are related through the openness parameter. Right? So we can bring this together here. Right? We've just collected one, yeah. It's 1 minus alpha is what relates the Q to ST. So we're going to bring it all together. So demand for goods, the demand for our production is going to be moved together with our domestic demand, right? Plus the effect about the terms of trade. So if the terms of trade go up, right, this means there are more goods baskets from our country for world good baskets. We're going to have here an increase in our home production. But assume that this omega parameter is positive. Right, which it should be, but you can imagine a situation maybe with very, very low risk aversion, right, that might less than 1, so it's more like risk taking behavior that can push it in the other direction. All right, now this is going to hold for every other country, and if we average this out, right, the average in terms of trade is going to be 0 on log terms. Right, you can think of this, bilaterally. Right, what's the log average think in terms of currency, so think of the log average, so exchange rate in BND dollar, and the log exchange rate of dollar to BND. That's going to be equal to 1. The product is equal to 0 when we take the log sum. The whole idea here, the reason why this is going to happen in our country is so small, it doesn't show up in the average. And we have all the other countries with their trading partners with each other. So if there's one person that has an advantage, there's another country that's at a disadvantage, an average, it evens out. So think of here, like we have, again, nominal exchange rate, so we don't want to do it with our home country, so let's think about the euro per dollar, and the dollar per euro, right, is going to be that. So here it's in the S, it's in the terms of trade, right, that real exchange rate, but if there's a higher, so let's say the goods in Europe for goods in America is high, well that must be the goods for America for goods from Europe is low, and exactly so much lower that the sum of the two in logs is equal to 0. Okay, so this gives us on the world market, world demand is equal to world consumption. Now, using the relationship between demand, consumption demand with risk sharing at home and abroad, we can relate our production at home to world production also via the terms of trade. Right, combining this together, we finally get back to our, we're ready to work with our consumption-Euler equation. We have this now in terms of our output. Our output is forward-looking. It depends on the real interest rate, but it also now depends on expected terms of trade. So if our terms of trade are expected to increase, right, more good baskets per world basket, this is going to reduce our production at home. So remember, when the nominal exchange rate goes up, this means that our currency depreciated. When the real exchange rate or the real terms of trade go up, this means that our goods depreciate, right? They're less valuable. So if they're expected to increase, then our goods, our production goes down. We can express this now instead of in terms of our consumer price inflation, we can express this in terms of our producer price inflation. get then just a different coefficient up front. Well, this terms of trade is related to foreign income. Right, so we can replace terms of trade with foreign income. So if we have this leading parameter here, alpha is positive when it's the openness parameter between 0 and 1. So if this capital theta is positive, then an increase in openness, right, is going to lead to a, do we have the definition of? Sigma. Let's see if we can see this on quickly here. Sigma A. Parameters, 1 over sigma A. Alpha, yeah. So that's why. So this whole thing here is the inverse of sigma A. And so if alpha goes up, this whole term goes up, so sigma alpha goes down. What does that mean? That means if we're open, we're going to be more sensitive. Domestic output will be more sensitive to domestic real interest rate. And we also have this obvious effect. The more open we are, the more sensitive we're going to be to expected changes in foreign production. Right? But here we also have that we're more sensitive to our real interest rate. Right? And this is due to the uncovered interest rate parity. Right? If we have an interest rate differential, right, this is going to cause our currency to appreciate, right? Which is going to then shift our demand towards foreign goods. And also shift then foreign demands away from our goods. Our net exports then, relative to GDP, the fraction of GDP, well, we have our right, we can multiply this through, we have the nominal terms, we have our production basket is equal to the price of our production basket. This is our nominal production, and our nominal demand is then our consumption basket plus its price, plus then here, our price over net exports. I can again approximate this and connect it to the terms of trade. Alright, we have that net exports. This is I think a good way to think about terms of trade, is what it does with net exports. So if the terms of trade go up, net exports go down. So if the terms of trade go up, that's more good baskets per world baskets. This leaves our net exports to go down. This means our goods price of foreign goods relative to domestic goods. So we can think of this then as our the export basket, the import basket. So if this goes up, we get more exports. Is also constants, that's why I'm confusing myself. Right, the relationship is ambiguous. We have that. Somebody said we get more export basket per import basket. This means we have to trade more goods to get a given level of input goods. So it's our imports become more expensive. And so our imports would go down, which would tend to increase our net exports. Just due to the effect on, that's because it's this ambiguity. And I want to figure this out. This is important. Why am I confusing myself here? So. Terms of trade goes up, that means more the price of our imports in terms of our exports. our imports become more expensive, so we would. Why is it the other way around? Oh, because we have, I'm doing this openness. Now open to one, completely open, and that's actually 1 for 1. Keep thinking it should be the exact opposite way around, and I can't. Ah, that's why, because it's, so in terms of trade, when the terms rate goes up, this means that the foreigners have to give up, it's the cost of what of their exports, for them, when they're buying from us, so our exports, in terms of their imports, if that goes up, that means the exports are more expensive. So the exports go down. If that goes up, that means our imports are cheaper, so we're going to import more, which is going to reduce our net exports, which is why that's why the minus sign. The reason why I write this up here to help myself, so this is the price. Think of here as like the price in our what we export of our imports. As the price of our exports go up, that means the price that other countries are paying, right, the cost for them of buying our goods goes up, so they're going to buy less of it. S goes up, net exports goes down. Sorry, I got lost there in a second. Okay, so the big picture then we have for the small open economy Phillips curve. We have that then we're going to see that our domestic inflation depends on expected inflation and real marginal cost, and both terms of trade and exchange rate shocks feed into the marginal cost. Right? We have this composition, CPI inflation has a domestic producer price inflation and this import price component. Right? So we've got another direct external channel into inflation dynamics. So not just the marginal cost channel we had before, but now the open economy channel. Right, so to see this, we can get to our Phillips curve in terms of our producer prices. Right, and it's exactly the same as it was before, except it's in terms of producer prices. So for the producer prices, right, it's the marginal cost, where we have a channel for the open economy. And then also if we think of the Phillips curve, if we want to express this in terms of the CPI inflation, then we would have this other component of import prices coming in. But if we look at our marginal cost, right, what's our marginal cost is going to be, right, the real wage from the producer's perspective relative to the marginal product of labor. We can rewrite this in terms of the real wage from the perspective of the household, right? So that we can then substitute in the household's labor-leisure trade-off, and we have now our technology shock. So an increase in technology, increase in productivity is going to lower marginal cost. We now have an additional effect here that we see. This is the exchange rate effect here. Again, from our terms of trade. And our risk sharing is going to connect domestic consumption to world income, right? We're trading things across, everyone's symmetric, so we're gonna be just like the rest of the world up into an effect that's being driven by different inflation rates in different countries, causing us to have different terms of trade or real exchange rates. And then from our domestic economy, we can relate our leisure to our domestic production, right? And we have from the production function, this also gives us the relation to A. Right, okay, so our marginal costs depend positively on both world and domestic output. That's the domestic output. As we want to produce more, we have more congestion per unit of production, we have more labor we're employed, so the marginal product is going to go down, which means we have to hire more labor, so our costs are going to go up. We have the effect of technology, more productiveness per unit we get of labor, we get more production, which means each additional unit of production costs us less than it did at the old level of productivity. But now we have foreign demand and foreign income and our terms of trade, right? And this is through, go back, where they enter in here. They're going to enter in, especially through this wealth effect through consumption. Right? And a major leisure trade-off, marginal utilities consumption. And so if we have higher world income, we're trading securities, this means the rest of the world is doing great. We're risk sharing. It's kind of like if you buy, if you own a stock, like if you buy an Apple stock, for example, then if Apple does better, you're wealthier. Regardless of whether or not you're more productive or not here in Vietnam, you own some of this increased production abroad. And what is this also going to do? Well, if you're wealthier, right? Let's say you own, you own an Apple stock, and now you're not going to be willing, perhaps, to work as hard, to work as many hours as before, right? I've got, Tim Cook on my speed dial. I don't need to work so hard. So that's this wealth effect here coming in here. And also, likewise, the terms of trade, as the terms of trade go up, this means we get terms of trade is reducing our net exports. I don't want to think about that. The terms of trade, reducing our net exports. Increasing our marginal costs, so it's going to be the wealth effect. It's the same thing as just the income. Right? If the rest of the world is doing better, we're feeling wealthier. And the rest of the world doing better would mean we would need to trade more of our home baskets for foreign baskets. And then we also have the second effect in terms of trade, as we saw here with the alpha, and then we have a combined effect, so it's just a unit component is through the difference between the producer price wage. Right? So if we have if these two don't go in the same don't move in lockstep, then we have a shift in the terms of trade, which essentially if we have that the real wage goes up for employers, but not one-for-one for the workers, and doesn't go by as much by the workers. This means right, that, the terms of trade have gone up. Right, which is giving us that same effect. Alright, so the wage, what will this mean? This means the wage for the employers have to pay relative to their competition is going up more than the wage has gone up from our perspective as consumers. So this is then this price differential. Right, we can eliminate here the terms of the trade and just get the components in terms of domestic and foreign output. Right, so we have the effect on marginal cost through employment and the terms of trade. Both of those are a positive effect. So the more production is here at home, right, the higher our marginal costs. World output we have here, two different directions that it can go. That's going to depend on which of these two is larger. So if foreign goods are highly substitutable amongst each other, what does this mean? This means if our goods become relatively more expensive compared to other goods from other countries, foreigners are going to switch to the other goods, right? So it would be, there's, what would that be? Maybe a high substitutability. If we have goods that could be produced by someone else, and if you think of maybe clothing manufacture, right? There's the substitutability is probably pretty high in the world market. Whether a shirt is produced in Vietnam or Indonesia or Turkey, your average world consumer probably doesn't care so much about the difference between them. Right? You could think of some goods with a lower level substitution. What might that be? Like you can think of either a coffee or rice from Vietnam, having perhaps a much higher quality, right? So if I have to buy rice from Thailand, I will. If it's a lot cheaper, I will, but I prefer to buy Vietnamese rice because it tastes better. So then there's a reduced substitutability. Some foreign goods are completely non-substitutable. So maybe I think of substituting cell phones from Huawei for Apple. Very low substitutability. If you're an Apple person, you don't want to do anything that's Android based, and it doesn't matter whether it's in China or Japan or whether it's our Vin phone that we were talking about a couple of days ago. Very low substitutability. So what does this mean? So if all of our foreign buyers, if they can easily substitute other countries' goods for our goods, high substitutability, right? Then this effect on consumption is going to dominate. Right, because then the real appreciation, right, to make up for this is smaller than the domestic effect to the real wages. All right, and then we have, of course, the direct effect from productivity. So let's, just like in the standard New Keynesian model, let's break this down into being expressed relative to our natural rate of production. And what we're going to find, you can use marginal cost. If we have flexible prices, these marginal costs are going to be constant. So this is going to implicitly define our natural rate of production relative to this constant marginal cost. And not just productivity, not just a technology shock as before, but now also world income.
Right, so we have this result from before of our markup. This steady state inverse log marginal cost. This markup increases, if there's less competition, this is going to reduce our average natural level of production. Right? So this is the deadweight loss from monopolistic competition. We have a positive effect from productivity. And we have this world output effect that's going to depend on right, the signs that we have in here. The effect of world output on marginal cost. It's the relative importance of the MR. Now you can see that it can be positive or negative depending on whether the effect of world output is positive or negative on marginal cost. It's just about whether or not we have the substitutability. If the substitutability sort of across countries is different than our substitutability across time or states, then one effect will be larger than the other. Right, so this gives us now our, we can now subtract, right, we can relate marginal costs and the output gap from before, and we get then that we have our marginal cost output gap expression. Right, so now the effect of domestic of foreign demand, foreign income, right, is we're going to raise natural output, just like productivity is going to raise natural output. So the question is whether our domestic output is above this level or not. So we get then our McKinsey-Phillips curve dependent now on the output gap. Or to keep in mind, this output gap is not just driven by productivity, but also world income, world demand. So we have, right, if we shut down alpha equals 0, right, so if we are then completely closed economy, if we're not open, then we have the standard closed economy McKinsey-Phillips curve. Right, this is all going to and then if we have a high substitutability amongst foreign goods,
an increase in openness is going to lead to a fall in the sigma alpha parameter, which is going to give us a fall in kappa alpha, so a smaller slope of the MVC. Right? The intuition here is then that a real depreciation brought about by an increase in domestic output is smaller, right? And so is then the effect on marginal costs and inflation. So you think if we have an increase, if we produce more goods, right, if we double our production of goods in the international market, that's going to drive down the price of our goods, right? Can increase the demand, right? This would tend to bring about here an appreciation and depreciation in our currency, or making our goods cheaper. And it's going to have an effect on marginal cost and inflation. So it's the question of which of these effects is larger. Okay, so now we want to try and do the same thing we did before. Let's relate then our IS curve to the output gap. Right, and we're going to have now output gap related to future output gaps with a negative relationship on the real interest rate deviations. But now, real interest rate deviations depend not only on political technology, but also on expected changes of foreign income. So let's think about the effects of monetary policy. Right? There are the three obvious monetary policies that we could look at. Policy could be targeting, like running maybe a Taylor rule and target either CPI inflation or domestic producer inflation, or we could be targeting the exchange rate. Right, under producer currency pricing, CPI stabilization is not optimal. Import price volatility, and it's going to change, it's going to distort these trade-offs. So we'll see the domestic producer inflation targeting is generally welfare superior. And this is kind of a problem. Why? Because what's best for the economy is something that consumers don't see. You know? Consumers care about the CPI inflation, the consumer price. That's the price that they feel. You know? It's generally in the best interest, however, to not target that, right, because we have lots of import price volatility. It's going to be moving that around. It's beyond the control of the domestic economy, something that our central bank can't stabilize. It can only stabilize at great costs. Okay? Right, so imagine if oil prices start to go up, right, and the Vietnamese central bank tries to stabilize prices, tries to stabilize the price of oil in Vietnam. That's a very challenging task for the central bank of Vietnam, because this commodity, right, is imported to a great amount. Right? This price is that would be very expensive. Vietnam would have to be subsidizing the price of oil, the price of gas for people, to maintain that price. This is generally going to be costly. Right? Exchange rate stabilization. Right? You might think, well, wait a second, we have the import price volatility, the export price. Right? Maybe if we stabilize the exchange rate, we can reduce then the effect of the open economy. Well, sure, right? But that would come at the cost of focusing on or paying attention to domestic inflation, right? So do we focus on domestic inflation? Do we focus on the exchange rate, or do we focus on this mixture of exchange rate and domestic inflation movements in CPI? All right, so you can think of here an interest rate rule, or a Taylor rule that we looked at in the last couple of days, but now with domestic inflation, domestic producer inflation, instead of just the inflation we had before. Right, we can write this out in the same sort of forward-looking manner we did before. And
So we can also recognize we're gonna have a condition for uniqueness, right, to rule out these sunspots, just like before. The condition is very similar, only now it's a little bit different because our slope in the Phillips curve has changed because of the open economy interaction. But assuming that's fulfilled, now we can look at, say, the effects of a monetary policy shock. Right, so this doesn't affect the natural rate of interest, right? Doesn't affect either productivity or world income. Think of an example where this would be different. So imagine if there's a shock to US interest rates. That's likely to affect world income. We have lots of, not just because America is a large economy, right, but also because there's so many financial assets that are related to or based off of interest rates in the United States. We have a large presence in financial markets, so that we'd end up having consumption risk-sharing movements would be affected by changes in the U.S. in nominal interest rate. But that's not the effect, that's not the case for our economy, where our economy is infinitesimally small. Right, and we can do the same method of undetermined coefficients that we did. Work this out and we get to a very, very similar expression. The only thing that's really changed here is that we have then this different slope of the Phillips curve. Right, but what we can see that's different is going to be based on the substitutability of goods. Right, so this, if we have high values of substitutability across countries and between foreign and domestic. Right, this gives us, we see that that's in on. Then we have that this is increasing in our openness. Right, so what we're trying to get at here is what's the effect of our economy being open. Right? If the economy is more open, so long as we have a sufficiently high degree of substitutability of our goods, or as long as it's a trading economy, not a specialized world economy, then increasing our openness makes us more exposed. Right? The shock impact of this monetary policy will be larger because the feedback effects through the open economy will be larger. If we have an economy where there's a lot of trading going on, there's a higher substitutability, and if we're sufficiently open. Right? Our interest rate dynamics, we have this potential reversal. Right? We have the shock of mu, which the direct effect is 1 for 1 on I. But then we have the automatic, the systematic component of monetary policy that responds to these deviations and the output gap and producer price inflation, which have gone down. All right, now how about the open economy variables? All right, so we see that the foreign variables, foreign income, are unaffected. All right, so the terms of trade are going to move directly with our output. Right, so the output and output gap are the same. All right, so this gives us a negative effect on the terms of trade with a positive monetary policy shock. And so contractionary monetary policy is going to reduce real exchange rates. It's going to appreciate our goods in terms of other goods. Right? So it's going to be appreciating the nominal exchange rate and improving the terms of trade. Terms of trade going down, right, means we have a better terms of trade. And so this is what always throws me off when we do the different routes. So the exchange rate going down means appreciation, right? Terms of trade improving means terms of trade going down. Okay. All right, so what are the long-run effects? What if we look at the sort of the cumulative effect of this? Right, so the total effect on V of this one shock. So we have the Q, it's spread out across time. Right, this gives us the effect that our sticky price producers, they front load this and they're going to respond a lot initially, but this stock shock is still going to remain high for a while. So we get this autocorrelation. If we look at the total, the cumulative effect of this shock, right, we're going to find that we have a long run effect on prices and the exchange rate. Right, so our prices are going to go down permanently. So we have a contractionary monetary policy. Inflation falls and then slowly returns to normal. The price level drops and then increases, but it doesn't increase back to its original level. We have a permanent drop in the price level, also a permanent drop then in our nominal exchange rate. This drops permanently, this drops permanently. We're keeping foreign prices constant. Right? Nothing to change that here. Because our country is so small, we're looking at one shock. Now the exchange rate, right, so we have a okay, so the long run effect on the exchange rate as it goes down, right, we can have an effect of the exchange rate overshooting, so going past and then coming back. Right, the literature on exchange rate overshooting is very large. You see this here in the short run. Here, except we have the late impact and the impact. There we go. So the shock is not too persistent. We get this overshooting result from Dornbush. And what this is this uncovered interest rate parity. Right, if we have this, large interest rate depreciation that has to happen from this interest rate parity. Okay. Let's look at a couple of alternatives and to see the difference. So let's you take a welfare return. If you look at the book, we can approximate the model so we can see how the variances and the different variables map into our household's utility or household's preferences. We saw in general. Right? With concave utility, our households would prefer sure things over risky things. Right? So in essence, we want to see how these different policies affect variances, the different variables that eventually can reduce down to variances of consumption and labor, which is what the household cares about. So we want to compare a simplified version of this domestic inflation Taylor rule with CPI based and the exchange rate and exchange rate peg version. Right, so essentially, the exchange rate peg is requires us to move or have inflation move opposite the terms of trade. So if our terms of trade are improving, so if they go down, we have to have a one-for-one decrease in inflation. Right? or the other way around in terms of causality. All right, so Jordi Galli looked at this model by setting parameters roughly to the economy of Canada. Right, so we're going to have log preferences. We're going to have Cobb-Douglas aggregators across countries and between foreign and domestic. We have our preference parameter with labor to match a friction elasticity of labor supply, and this epsilon, remember epsilon over epsilon minus 1 gives us our markup. All right, so this is a 6 over 5, right, so it's a 20% markup over marginal cost. We have our capital parameter, stickiness parameter at 3/4, translates to average price adjustment of once per year. And our alpha at 0.4, so this gives us a labor share of income of about 0.6. And we choose this parameter 5 pi, 1.5, which is a pretty standard value. All right, and now what's also going to perhaps guide or decide which of these policies is better is maybe which is more volatile, our TFP or foreign demand. Right? Also, which parameters are more important for the effect of the transmission of the open economy versus the transmission of the domestic economy. Things like our openness parameters and the elasticities. All right, and now we can look then at our impulse responses to a productivity shock. So if we look at our domestic inflation target, if we start off there, this is going to be closest to what we saw yesterday. So we have the output gap falls, right, so productivity goes up, output goes up, but not by as much as it would if prices were flexible. With the domestic inflation targeting, this response, this difference is relatively small. Right? We have inflation, right? Inflation falls, right? And it stays, it stabilizes pretty quickly, both in the producer. Right? We have CPI inflation goes up. Right? We have an initial terms of trade shock that goes up and then slowly comes back down. So terms of trade going up is a decrease, and it's an unfavorable change in the terms of trade. Right? If we peg the nominal exchange rate, right, what this means is that we're going we have to have this change in terms of trade, and our producer inflation, right, are going to be they have to move together. Right, so we have change in the terms of trade with the negative inflation. So here, terms of trade went up by 0.4. So this means domestic inflation has to go down by 0.4. Holding. And so if the exchange rate stays constant and our production or our producer prices fall, right, this makes our goods directly cheaper by that same amount in foreign currency. Right? And there's no movement in the exchange rate that might make that effect smaller, reduce that effect, and also help us shift demand away from more expensive imported goods. Right, domestic inflation, the effect of domestic inflation is very, very large, right, and this leads to a very large drop in the output gap. Right? So the output gap, remember, output goes up by 1 in this scenario, 1%. So an output gap of
Almost -1 means that, although the natural rate of output went up by 1, output barely goes up at all here, right? And it's simply because we have this, this terms of trade can't respond very quickly to shift demand between domestic and foreign goods. The consumer inflation targeting, and it has a lot of the same responses that you see with the inflation tape. I mean, what it does a lot better job at than any other is, well, stabilizing consumer price inflation. So for prices, for the consumer at least, are a lot more stable than any of the scenarios. But producer price inflation has this very long drawn out effect. We have this hump shape, so the building up of terms of trade, they're large, they just get worse and worse until they start to improve a little bit, which gives us these large output gap effects. For the nominal exchange rates, here we see the inflation of the exchange rate peg, keeps that constant. Right. For all of the other policies, we see that the nominal exchange rate goes up. So this means the dong depreciates. So we're more productive. Right, our goods and our currency, right, are available at lower cost. The exchange rate here in dong per foreign currency goes up. Our domestic price, CPI level, we have inflation, and now if we look at the level under our consumer inflation targeting, or Taylor rule, the spread level here, right, this small, these decreases are small, right, the level at the end, the price level, we do have a decrease in the consumer price level from productivity. This makes sense, right? If we have a shift in productivity, should probably perhaps lead to a decrease in prices, although it's not a permanent shock. We get that the optimal policy is one that stabilizes here domestic inflation so that the domestic price level doesn't change. So we hold the domestic price level constant, which means we get a large depreciation in our currency with response to this increase in productivity, giving us then here an output gap, right, that stays at 0. So we're able to essentially get the 1-for-1 increase in production that we would in an economy without price rigidities. Right? So what monetary policy needs to do, right, in response to the productivity shock, it needs to be aggressive in an expansionary monetary policy, right, making sure the price level doesn't fall, the price level contracting would counteract this optimal, right, increase in the nominal exchange rate to make sure that foreign demand keeps up with our increased productivity. That's the domestic, or this producer price inflation targeting, output gap, domestic inflation, and the output gap domestic inflation stays unchanged roughly by construction. The output gap, that's not, are reduced. Yeah? The nominal interest rate is reduced to support this expansion. The nominal interest rate follows from our interest rate parity with a constant world interest rate. Right? We have to, right, so what do we have there? We have our
initial depreciation followed by an extended appreciation, as long as I star stays constant, which we're holding it constant in this experiment. This tells us that our nominal interest rate here, right, has to fall and then rise again. Right, we have to have then here a mean reversion of the nominal exchange rate. Right, if we compare this with consumer inflation targeting, we have this permanent fall in the CPI, but right, the consumer inflation targeting partially stabilizes domestic consumer prices. And so we kind of have right, we want to reduce the response in terms and trade so that our the cost to consumers of our imports in the domestic currency that have changed because of the exchange rate shift, right, that this is then muted. Yeah? In order to not have the terms of trade react as strongly, so to minimize this effect, this allows us to have requires us to accept a much larger negative output gap. Right? So this implies a more contractionary monetary policy than under the domestic inflation targeting rule, or Taylor rule. If we peg the exchange rate, right, we have in terms of trade response that's very small. Right, the exchange rate can't depreciate, so price in the foreign countries hasn't changed their price level or producer price level. Right, so a very small response to terms of trade. So it had very large effects on the output gap in domestic inflation. Okay. How would we compare these? Well, we can look at the individual, if we run simulations under these different policy regimes and calculate the variations of our different variables, we see that our domestic inflation Taylor rule stabilizes domestic inflation and doesn't worry so much about it at CPI inflation, and it stabilizes output pretty significantly. If we compare this with the consumer price Taylor rule, the consumer price Taylor rule does a much better job at stabilizing CPI inflation. And this comes though at the cost of a more volatile output. Right? So it's not clear, perhaps directly there, which one of these two is to be preferred. The exchange rate peg, right, where we see the nominal depreciation rate, right, it stabilizes that by construction. And if you look through the different policies, you're going to find that the optimal policy is going to be a domestic inflation Taylor rule with a very, 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 very high parameter. So we're essentially going to be completely stabilizing domestic inflation. Right, this brings with it a smallish CPI inflation variability. The inflation, the nominal interest rate is also pretty low. In terms of trade, however, this is getting our terms of trade to take up most of the slack. It's always kind of where to push. We have things moving exogenously. We have our TFP shock, our productivity shock. We have foreign income shocks moving around that we can't stabilize. If we stabilize one thing, this means something else has to take up the variability. And it turns out, in some cases, it's good to kind of hold everything a little bit low rather than completely stabilizing one thing. But here it turns out that we have an optimal policy if we stabilize domestic inflation completely. And then we'll see that output is a little variable, but output gap should be less variable. Okay. Well, you get this, you show that the excess smoothness, right? We get a terms of trade that's very smooth, very domestic depreciation rate, very constant. So if you think of the economy for trading on, this would seem to be very advantageous. Prices, currency prices are completely constant, and relative goods prices for traders are also as the most constant among all of these. Right? But what this means is that we have all of the variability is being pushed then onto like our households components. We have volatile, more volatile output, right? Domestic inflation is then also very, very volatile. Okay. So we've looked now through a extension. We started to think about the open economy, right? And there are lots of things that we would, you could think of would be important to make this then more useful for your particular country, as opposed to just this stylized small open economy. Right? What I want to do now is take a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back. Let's look at the computer code a little bit together, and let's look at the practice exam that I just loaded up this morning together. So we can talk about that, and then actual answers for that we'll look at then on Friday. So do a little, because you have the answers, you're going to look at the answers, we're trying to just try and write some things down before Friday, just so you get a feel for when you see the answers on Friday, or we talk about the answers on Friday, a better honest feel for how you're doing. All right, so 10 minutes.